Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second episode of the Truffle Webinar Series, exploring the full life cycle of developing and deploying a Dapp. And we're really excited to continue the journey with you guys. If you missed the first episode, that's okay. We have a recording of it. And Kevin and Amal are actually going to recap some of that a little bit in the top of this episode. And then we'll move into episode 2, which will continue that kind of conversation. So I just want to reiterate a little housekeeping for everyone who is new to Crowdcast. This is the platform we're using right now. As you can see at the bottom there is a ask a question, which you can load up your questions there, which Kevin and Amal will answer at the end of the webinar. So we'll save some time for that. But load them up there as you're thinking of them as you go through. You can also obviously use our right side chat there. There's a really neat feature where if you add a question in the chat, you can actually, there's a little button that kind of hovers and said, do you want to make this a question? And then that automatically pops that into the question queue. We also have some polls we'd love you to fill out if you haven't already. It's going to help Kevin and Amal understand your experience level and the kind of things that you're interested in as they talk through this webinar. And then, if you want to actually record clip moments of this, we lost them all, but he'll be back. There's a little button on the far left, which it says clip moment. So if there's a moment that you want to just record of this webinar and just save that little excerpt, that's a neat feature of Crowdcast as well. So you could do that. But remember, this whole webinar will be recorded. And for everybody attending today, we will send you the link to that recording after this webinar so you can watch it again if you'd like. And outside of that, we are really excited to have you attend TruffleCon 2020 this year. It's our blockchain developer conference that we're really excited about. So you see a little button there at the bottom. It's free to register right now. We still have a really cool chocolate tasting experience available that you can get up until October 16th. So I'd grab it now while you're on the webinar or today or whatever, sooner the better. But we would love to see you, and we'll continue the conversation we have today at blockchain conference and TruffleCon. So that'll be something that you guys will really benefit from. And also we have some really extra some surprises as well, extra rooms and a built with Truffle showcase, as well as a poker charity tournament that will be really fun to participate in. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Kevin and Amal. There we go.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Hey, thank you, Shay. So hey, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and see the screen okay. Shout if not, if there's any issues with audio, video, etc. But as Shay mentioned, this is episode 2 of this 5-part series wherein we're kind of diving into the life cycle of building and developing, building, testing, etc. a decentralized application. Quick reminder on who we are, either as a refresher if you were at the last one or if this is the first one you're attending. So my name's Kevin Bluer. I'm the head of training and ecosystem engineering here at Truffle. With that, I'll hand over to Amal to introduce himself.
Yeah, as Kevin said, I'm Amal. I'm a developer on the Truffle team. I'm looking forward to helping you guys on your journey. There you go, Kev.
Cool. Yeah, your audio sounds good, by the way, Amal, because we were just
yes. Much better. Good job.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Alrighty. So let's keep going. So just a quick recap, or 2 recaps. One, just to frame the series and kind of where we are in the journey, and then also a quick recap of the last episode as well. Really, in terms of the series, the overall goal of the series is to give you some exposure and to get hands-on with the complete development life cycle of building a decentralized application. We've got this kind of fancy graphic here on this slide. As I mentioned in the last episode, historically as a suite of tools, Truffle Suite, because there's multiple tools within the suite, has been kind of firmly focused on the left-hand side of this workflow, e.g. the coding, the building, the testing, with a couple of things, on the right, but it's always been a bit more kind of, I wouldn't say patchy, but just, less emphasis placed on the right-hand side here. That's changing with our newest tool, our latest tool, which is something called Truffle Teams. And that kind of starts to fill in or give us a story around those other pieces that, which are equally important, particularly so with the emergence of things like decentralized finance or DeFi, wherein it's very often that you need to want to like interact with existing on-chain contracts, and just generally have a more robust development experience. And we'll be getting into all of that, starting with this episode really, because in the last one we didn't kind of touch on that too much. And then in terms of where we're at in the roadmap, as mentioned, this is episode 2. Big caveat on this slide, really, we are not following this that thoroughly at all. So although we call out testing, releasing, and deploying in this episode, we will be kind of dipping into that. But really it's, we just kind of threw these in as kind of guides, I guess, for the different episodes. But it's a little bit more that we're kind of jumping, kind of moving back and forth around this life cycle. And as you'll see today, we're really focusing on Ganache. So kind of overlaying that with some of these steps. So just kind of caveating that up front, that it's not going to be as explicit as it's kind of conveyed here on this slide. But yeah, either way, we were going to, as we go through this series, we're going to be definitely touching pretty deeply on most of these facets. Cool. All right. So a quick review of what we covered last episode. Really, as mentioned, to kind of start the journey, we started with a 10,000 feet, a high level view of decentralized applications. What we mean by that. What's the paradigm all about? How's it different to centralized application development, and kind of arguably the status quo that we've had for a long time. We also did a kind of overview again of the Truffle Suite, just to frame it, just in case you are brand new to this space. And then the second half of the last episode was getting more hands-on. So we actually started to write a contract called Simple Storage, which is often regarded as kind of the hello world-y type thing of this domain. We did it in a TDD manner, a test-driven development kind of manner or approach, in that we started to write the tests first, saw them fail, and some interesting kind of errors were bubbling up, and we resolved them. Eventually got all the tests to pass. So we kind of essentially implemented the kind of first phase, if you like, of our journey. In that we got a contract. It was building. The tests were passing, as mentioned, and then we actually closed out the last episode with a coding challenge. And no worries, by the way, if you didn't get to that, or you're watching this episode and you're like, "What's he talking about?" So to kind of recap that, with that, perhaps I'll hand over to yourself, Amal, to kind of frame what the challenge was all about and
sure,
how we tackled it. Yeah.
So as Kevin was saying, like, we introduced Truffle Suite, and there's a lot to understand and cover before you can get to the really interesting bits. Another way of saying that is there's a lot of things that Truffle, or workflows that Truffle simplifies for you, that makes your life easier, so you can get to the really cool bits of coding that you want to do, i.e. your business logic. So from last week, we wanted you to get comfortable with the workflow, installing the tools, adding new functionality, small bits of functionality like a mapping, using using modifiers, and getting custom with various assertions, writing assertions. And that's all. It's just to get your feet wet and show you how Truffle simplifies your workflow and takes care of a lot of those boilerplate type workflows, like getting contracts onto a chain, so that you can just focus on, hey, what am I doing with my contract?
Awesome.
There's a link we'll send you, so you can go to the review recap and try it yourself. All right.
Yep. Yeah,
right,
that's the link there.
You good? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, Shay, you've sent. If you sent, I can't actually see the chat, but I think you've sent that.
Yep. It's in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah. So that actually is the solution to it, or an implementation of the solution, if you want to dissect it. And by the way, and this applies, as Shay mentioned at the start, any questions both on the solution, or if you did tackle the challenge and perhaps solved it differently, or just still stuck on something, feel free to ask questions either about that, and of course, as we go through this episode, about anything that we cover. Cool. Oh, and by the way, we will be using the solved version of this as we go through today's episode and start to explore Ganache in more depth. Kind of side note here, and this is just really to put it on your radar as a thing if you've not heard of it before, and that's something called OpenZeppelin. What OpenZeppelin is, well, it's a few things, but the thing in this context is it's a collection of contracts that really solve a lot of common things when building contracts. Common things like access control or creation of a token standard, etc. And the reason we call this out now is twofold. One is because, as per the challenge, one of the tasks was to add a layer of essentially kind of authentication through that function modifier that Amal mentioned. E.g., only certain individuals, based on their account address, can invoke certain functions. That often comes in two different flavors of acronym, either role-based access control or role-based access management. And the reason we're calling that out now is because OpenZeppelin has a really robust implementation of that. So if you click on openzeppelin.com and then click on /contracts, or maybe better still, look at their GitHub repo and then browse into the contracts directory, you should see a subdirectory within there called access. And that really is a kind of deeper implementation of that. But that said, as mentioned, OpenZeppelin is a lot more than that. But I mentioned a bunch, bit of detail there. Really, the takeaway from this slide is that there is more robust, kind of battle-tested implementations out there, and most of all, just to put OpenZeppelin on your radar if it's not come up before. And if you have been in the space for a while, it's pretty likely you would have heard of it already. But if not, it's a great library to know about. Okay, let's jump into this episode. So as mentioned earlier, we're really going to be diving into all things Ganache in this episode. Specifically, what we're going to be exploring, firstly, the what is Ganache, just both from a kind of practical perspective, it's kind of detailed perspective, what is it? And also a little bit on the kind of philosophy, the kind of why of Ganache, and where does it fit into the, into things, into that workflow that we've been referring to. We'll also be looking at the different flavors, because Ganache does come in a bunch of different flavors. Of course, by flavors, I mean kind of versions or variations that serve different purposes, and we'll be exploring those. We'll do that by both with a little bit of slides, but also by getting hands-on with it. And again, as always, we'd encourage you to probably not follow along during this webinar, although you're welcome to, but really to kind of try this out after this webinar. You can, as always, the best way to learn is by doing, of course. And then we'll close out by looking at Truffle Teams, as mentioned, which as we'll see more and more as we go through this series, is really we think brings a lot of value in terms of the workflow. And specifically, we'll be looking at one of the new flavors of Ganache, which is something called sandboxes, essentially hosted Ganache instances on Truffle Teams. And again, we'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so just to make it a little bit more interactive, let's jump over to that poll that Shay mentioned at the start. Just in case you haven't had a chance to get to it yet, you should see at the bottom of the screen, there should be a poll link. Click on that, it just pops up the questions. Only, I think, two questions there. Have you, used Ganache before? And if so, which version have you kind of lived in the most, whether it's the CLI, the UI, sandboxes? And then I think the second question, assuming I'm getting that right, is just have you used Ganache forking before? And that's something we're also going to be looking at today as well, which is a bit more of a kind of intermediate feature, but a very, very important one as well.
Yeah. So as of now, and hopefully if you guys I'll give you a second to answer if you haven't already. But what we have so far, Kevin and Amal, is that in terms of using Ganache before, we have a few people that have not. Mm-hmm. We do have a few people that have, and they used Ganache UI, and some more have used Ganache CLI. And then in terms of sandboxes, no, not yet. And nobody's used all versions of Ganache, of course. And then finally, in terms of Ganache forking, most people would love to learn more. They have not used it yet. Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks, Jay.
Well, great. Yeah. So we, as mentioned, big focus of this episode is going to be on all of that, all of the above. So yeah, again, no worries, if you haven't used any version at all, or, just kind of lived, predominantly in one version. Cool. Okay, just before we kind of start to get into the kind of the meat of the session today, just what is Ganache at the high level, or the kind of why, as mentioned, to start with. Probably rather obviously, because we've alluded to it or mentioned it in the last episode, it's your own personal kind of development blockchain. A few things, that are, emphasized in it. And that is, ease of spinning it up, minimal, arguably probably zero configuration needed to get up and running, depending on the flavor or the version, it's literally, either a single click or a single install. And then, as simple as it really can be, just to spin up an instance of, an Ethereum blockchain. And we, side note, we have, other versions as well, or protocols that, Ganache supports, but that's beside the point right now. It's built for development, unlike some of the other clients that you might use. If you were, considering using perhaps or exploring things like Geth or Parity or other kind of node or client, software. Nothing inherently wrong with them at all. But their kind of primary purpose is actually for you to host your own node. Be that, if you're running it, joining a test net or mainnet or private or consortium network. That's kind of the primary, use of those pieces of software, and whereas Ganache is solely built for development, and because of that we can bake things into it that really help in that life cycle and in that workflow. As mentioned already, comes in a number of flavors. I won't dwell on that because we're going to be covering that. And the same with that last bullet under that, on the kind of middle of the screen there is, we have this concept of forking that we're going to be exploring later on, wherein you can essentially simulate an existing network, in terms of everything that's gone on within it prior, in terms of all the blocks that have been mined, transactions within those blocks, and so on. But we'll get to that later. Anything you want to add, Amal, on top, just to build on that?
Yeah, it's also like another perspective is to think about when you're developing your contract. Ganache is really a mock of the blockchain. And because it's a mock, it allows you to iterate very quickly, because you could be working on your contract, adding some functionality, and you want to test it quickly. Ganache allows you to test it without waiting for deployment on mainnet or the testnet. So you can iterate back and forth and not lose context as you're like, hey, I just made this change. What happened? If you have to wait 20 or 30 minutes between every cycle, it's going to be very slow. But Ganache allows you to just go. And that's one thing to keep in mind. And these are Kevin's going to speak about it, but these are the things that Ganache really brings to the table.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mark. Cool. Okay, so diving in. So the first version we're going to be looking at, or flavor, is actually kind of more passively invoked or spun up. And that's actually via one of the Truffle commands, which is Truffle develop. As we'll see in a moment, that actually spins up a Ganache instance for you behind the scenes. And, as kind of Amal alluded to, kind of with an emphasis on speed. So it also, it spins up a Ganache instance, and we'll see this. It also creates 10 accounts, exposes all those accounts via an accounts object. It mounts, essentially, for want of a better term, a Web3 instance, and allows you to kind of interact with that in a kind of REPL-like manner. It also exposes all the artifacts, for the given context of the project that you're running Truffle develop within, which allows you to invoke any functions that you've created within your contracts. So really, it's this quick, and the reason we started with this one is this is the quickest way, kind of the quickest way, most kind of seamless way to get started. So that's kind of one. We're going to show two versions right now, both this one, which is essentially Ganache CLI, in terms of, what you're getting exposed, accessing. But we're also going to look at another one hands-on in a moment. So just to kind of frame that, and that is, as mentioned, Ganache UI, which is sometimes referred to as just Ganache. If you're kind of browsing around on like our GitHub org and you see just Ganache, it's typically referring to Ganache UI. And then Ganache CLI is the, as you'd guess, the CLI version, command line version. And we're going to look at both of these hands-on in a moment, which I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of context first. And then, Ganache UI, rather obviously, and as per the screenshot of it, is, very visual. And side note, it's cross-platform, so it's you should be able to install it as with Ganache UI pretty much on any on any base OS. But what Ganache UI does, as per again the screenshot, is exposes visually all the kind of core constructs or elements that you're going to be wanting to work with as part of that development lifecycle or development workflow. Where it really shines, I think, is particularly if you're quite new to this space and you almost don't know what you don't know, right? When you're starting all things, you're like, gosh, starting to get a feel for certain things, but you don't know what's outside of your radar that perhaps should be on your radar. So I think that's one of the real strengths of UI, in that, as you can see, and we'll see this hands-on in a moment, that you can just kind of click around and start to get a feel for the things that you need to be, cognizant of, as part of this development lifecycle, development workflow. Cool. All right. So let's get hands-on with both of those. So with that, I'm going to come out of full screen here, and so did me, by the way, on my screen. So probably Amal and I will kind of take turns, I guess. So, right. So hopefully this is going to work. Let's just close out some stuff. All right, so we are, and by the way, shout at any issues with, I've kind of cranked up my resolution here. Hopefully you can see everything fine. But yeah, jumping in, and let me just do one thing, just pull up this slide on the left-hand side here so we can kind of cross-reference what we're going to do. So as mentioned, though, we're going to, pull up Truffle and develop, just move my keyboard so I can actually see it. So as mentioned, we're not explicitly starting Ganache here. It's more implicit. Side note, there is a Ganache CLI, command or binary that will actually spin up, and we'll get to that later. This is essentially doing that for us. If you notice, when I run that command, it does a bunch of stuff. It spits out a bunch of stuff. So firstly, it tells us the RPC URL for this instance, this Ganache instance, so we can start mount to that and start sending JSON RPC calls to it. That'll be one option. But that's, kind of jumping ahead a little bit. What it also does, as mentioned, is creates 10 accounts for us. They're all loaded up with 100 Ether. It also exposes all those accounts as an accounts object. So you can see there, if you just type accounts, there's an array of the accounts. That's essentially the same as what just showed above here in this kind of zero indexed list of the accounts. We can check the balance of them. So if we did, this is an example of the Web3, instance, or kind of REPL, for want of a better way of saying it. So we can actually just check the balance of a given account here. Pass in the first account. We should see a very large number come back. Accounts. There we go. So that's actually 100, I think, is that going to be like 18 zeros? So that's essentially our balance in Way, which equates to 100 Ether. Point being, without getting into the weeds of that, that's 100 Ether, and obviously stuff that we can use to pay for our gas as we send transactions to the Ganache instance. What we can also do, I didn't mention this yet, but we are in the context. I've run this instance in the simple storage project, essentially continuing from where we left off in the last episode. So what we can then do is actually go ahead and migrate these contracts to this instance. So when you're in the develop console, you can essentially call the same Truffle commands. So as you might see in the docs and stuff, you might see Truffle and then the name of the command. If you're in the console, develop console, then you can just you don't need to put that Truffle prefix, because you can just fire off the Truffle commands. So just to kind of remind you, in the first episode, we were doing things like Truffle test and so on. And that was, spinning up the Ganache instance, deploying them, running the tests, and then tearing it down. This time we've run Truffle develop, and now we can do migrate, which is migrating these contracts ourselves to this Ganache instance that's been spun up. So now we've done that. As we also mentioned, the build artifacts, which are essentially a kind of representation of everything that's kind of gone on within a given project, and you see them in the directory name is build, I think, contracts, and then you see the JSON files that are kind of mirrors of the contracts that you have in your contracts directory. And then we can invoke some functions on those. So let's go ahead and do that. Storage, deployed, a instance of that contract, and it was set for data. Just pass in arbitrary number 321. So we got a transaction receipt back from it. So essentially what we've done there is, created an instance of the artifact or the contract more specifically, and then invoked the function, or one of the functions that it exposed. And then in this transaction receipt, it gives you a bunch of information as well, such as the block that made it into, the amount of gas used, etc. The from address, and this from would correspond to the first address. By default, everything comes from the first address. And then that to would be the contract address that got deployed when we ran the migrate. Cool. Anything to add, Amal?
No, it's pretty good. You can verify the contract address with instance address.
Instance dot address. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. That looks like the same. Yeah. So as mentioned, kind of to say that rhetorical question, but what if you're more of a visual person? Because this is a little more, I wouldn't say, more advanced in a sense. If you're not, fully living in CLI land, then we of course have the Ganache GUI. So Ganache UI. I'll get it wrong because I think the official name is Ganache, but I'll use UI or GUI probably interchangeably to refer to the kind of visual version of Ganache.
Hey, Kevin. I just want just quickly, just to summarize what we did here is Kevin took a contract, deployed it to a managed local instance of a chain, and is able to interact with it and run experiments and see what's going on. So this is one use case where Truffle Develop is going to be very useful.
Yeah. Thanks, Amal. Cool. So essentially what we're going to do is do that again now, this time using the Ganache UI. I always get the terminology wrong because it really is officially called just Ganache, but the UI version. So the way in which we do that, so again, kind of once you've got it installed, you can go to trufflesuite.com/Ganache and just install. That gives you kind of a launchpad to all the different versions that we have. In this case, you can click to download this version, the Ganache UI version. The way you kind of start this up is click Add Project. I obviously kind of jumped over a step there when it's like New Workspace on that kind of initial screen that you'll see if you're installing it for the first time. That'll take you here, and then you actually add a project. So you do, Ganache UI does require an existing project behind the scenes to have been created, either via Truffle init. So if you recall back in the first episode, Amal did Truffle init to kind of create a blank project that you perhaps added some stuff to, or if you've unboxed a project via Truffle Unbox, or just have a project that one of your colleagues has spun up. So whichever way you've got access to a project, you click Add Project, jump in, and then just select the config file. So essentially, that's telling Ganache UI what it needs to load up and the kind of context within which to operate. So let's open that up, save the workspace, and boom, there we go. So it's now taken us into the the kind of visual sort of workspace. First thing to note is it's kind of similar in the sense of we can see 10 accounts here. By the way, this is going to be a separate instance to what we just saw on the CLI or via Truffle Develop, and it's running on different ports. So I think even though Truffle Develop, if I just refer back, I did stop it, but even if it was still running, then it would have wouldn't have conflicted. That runs on 8545, whereas Ganache UI by default, at least, it runs on 7545. But yeah, again, back to what we're looking at here, we can see the 10 accounts that have been created. Similarly, you can get access to their private keys. You just click on that little key icon to the right hand side there, and then just to kind of briefly browse through some of the tabs here, you can obviously see all the blocks. The default is set to something called auto mining. So what that means is any transaction that's sent to this Ganache instance will be instantly mined, or basically instantly added to a new block. A block will be created and that transaction will be added to that block. which, as Amal kind of mentioned earlier, from a kind of workflow perspective, that's really nice. It's just instantaneous. You're not needing to wait for consensus to be reached on a block, and stuff if you're doing stuff on a test net and, of course, on mainnet, because that can take a while and be potentially quite costly. You can also see the transactions. There aren't any transactions yet. We'll change that in a moment. You can also see the contracts. What this is a reflection of the build artifacts. So again, as you do a truffle compile, that will generate these artifacts, and then essentially that's what shows up in here. What we don't see yet is means of kind of clicking into it, and that's because they've not yet been deployed to this Ganache instance, and we're going to do that in a moment. And then the other two tabs we'll kind of get to in the actual thing we're going to look at is actually the creation of an event or the emission of an event in a moment. So let's actually now connect to this Ganache instance. And the way we can do that, or connect to this instance and actually try some stuff, try interacting with it, deploying the contracts again. So the way we can do that is via a new or another command, which is truffle console. And then you actually, there are some defaults, but I more than often would specify, explicitly specify the network that I want to connect to. That needs to be declared in your truffle config. I won't show that just yet, just for speed, but when you create a new boilerplate or blank truffle project via init, it actually kind of puts a lot of comments in the truffle config, telling you what you need to drop in there to specify the different networks, be that like a development environment, testnet, mainnet, a Ganache sandbox, etc. So we're going to be referring back to that later. So, just for now, bear with us, and we'll just see, I'll just pass this in directly. So I've already pre-canned or pre-created one in there. So truffle console, and then the network parameter or argument, and then the name of that network. So Ganache GUI, and awesome. So really what truffle console does, or has done in this case, is it essentially gets you to the same place that doing truffle develop takes you to, or it takes you to the same place. But it doesn't, it's working the assumption that there's going to be a Ganache instance running. So essentially kind of won't spin one up for you. But once we're here, we can do exactly the same thing. So let's just run migrate again. And when the gods are working in our favor, then yeah, great. So we just, so you get all the kind of migration output there. And then kind of happened in the background, if you just in case you didn't see it, but then we got some contract addresses show up, and the status changed there. And then by default, Truffle creates this migrations contract. I think I mentioned that briefly in the last episode. One transaction actually gets sent to that directly as part of the deployment, and every time there's a new deployment, that increments. So that's why we see a 1 there. Obviously, for our simple storage contract in this case, because this is a new Ganache instance, no transactions have been sent to it yet. So let's just quickly do the same again. I'll just kind of fast track through that. Simple storage, deployed, use X this time for the, and just X set, and then do the same thing. Let's do suspicious number 888. And boom, great. And then again, that was hidden from view there, but we saw that the transaction count, if you didn't look before, was 0. Now it's 1, and now we can actually click into it. And great, we can see that a transaction has been sent to this contract. Again, we can see the externally owned account that it came from, the from address, the transaction hash. We can click into it, and we can see a bunch more, kind of similar stuff that got kind of returned to standard out in terms of the transaction receipt. That's kind of just given us, in the same place here, but just with a little more kind of visual structure around it, as it were. So yeah, so that's pretty neat. What we're now going to do, just to kind of briefly build on the simple storage. What was our little cheesy scenario, Amal?
I just uploaded a branch.
You uploaded a branch. Oh, thank you very much. I don't necessarily. Oh, I guess I did need to cancel out that. So yeah, there's a kind of in joke there, but yeah. So let's pretend in our kind of development life cycle here that my colleague Amal has added something. He's created a new branch, pushed something to that branch, and I'm like, gosh, I want to see what he's done. So let's check out feature event on set. So he's let's have a quick look at the code just on the command line here. Contrast storage is going to be a bit hard to read, but what Amal has kindly done is added an event there, or declared the event called SS value stored, simple storage value stored, that emits the address of the person that updated the value of stored data and the new value. And you can see the emit declaration here within our set stored data. So let's go back into our instance. And then we can do a migrate reset, just essentially to kind of blitz everything over the top. This is essentially a kind of revised version of this contract here. So I'm probably need to come back out. A bunch more blocks are being added. Oops, go back into the contracts. No transactions here. Let's do the same again. Third time. Storage. Void. Set it again. Number anyone? 321. Oh, set. Name wrong. Set stored data. So we should see something slightly different. It's still going to update that value of stored data or the state. But if we now click into it, hey, we see that this also, well, it's now emitted an event as well. And similarly, we kind of parked, so we didn't look at these other two tabs earlier, but all the events, so if you have a bunch of contracts, as your projects grow a little bit, and perhaps you've got multiple contracts, different events being emitted across different places, you'd see this, kind of them showing up in this entire list here, which is kind of good for kind of as a reference point. And then the last tab, as it were, within the UI version is this logs. And then this is just essentially a kind of rolling log of all the RPC requests that are made to the underlying chain. So it kind of just gives you that. So particularly kind of useful if you're kind of troubleshooting, what was the actual call that was made, and and similarly, any kind of errors or any kind of weirdness that's going on. Here often you'll see something kind of reflecting that here, or potentially, depending on what the issue is. Cool. All right. So let me just make sure we kind of covered everything that we're planning on covering. So we saw two versions of Ganache there. We saw the CLI version kind of passively or kind of implicitly loaded up via the Truffle develop command. And then we also saw, the GUI version and how that gives us a kind of nicer visual kind of representation of things. And then we also added something new to our simple storage contract and then redeployed that to our UI version, GUI version. And saw that was an event and saw what that got emitted. Cool. Alrighty. So let's go back to full screen. Cool. So a few more things to know about Ganache, just to kind of give you some sort of extra nuggets as we kind of go through this episode. Firstly, Ganache, because this sometimes comes up. Where does kind of Remix fit in? And if you're not familiar with Remix, it's a tool created by the Ethereum Foundation, which is really good. Particularly if you kind of spending time diving into Solidity as a language. Because you can just kind of paste and hack around and just immediately kind of invoke and do certain things. So Ganache does play nicely with that, in that you can point Remix. By default it loads up its kind of JavaScript VM in browser, but you can actually choose to have a different provider, and that can be Ganache running locally. So Remix will kind of point at that, and again you get to sort of benefits of perhaps potentially especially if you use the UI version, you'll be able to see things change. Kind of Command tab or Windows key tab back and forth, just to play with be doing stuff from Remix and then seeing it show up in Ganache, whichever version really, but maybe the UI version, again, particularly if you're starting out. Ganache also works nicely with browser-based wallets such as MetaMask, and again that's kind of more when you're trying things out in the browser. If you're building, when you get into kind of building the front end to your decentralized app, you want to be able to invoke functions or sign transactions more specifically from within the browser. A MetaMask is, again, if you've been in the space for a while, you're gonna, probably have used it a bunch. But if not, it's a wallet that exists within, that you can install in your browser. And again, we'll get to that in subsequent episodes. But point being, it plays nicely in the sense gives you the private keys that you can kind of spin up or import into MetaMask, with a couple of clicks. The last point is, or at least on this list, was that as we alluded to, and this is segueing us up, setting up the segue into talking about forking. Forking allows us to simulate any network, because all the networks, I say all, but really the networks that we've kind of spun up thus far have been empty, right? There's been either zero blocks essentially, or one gets mined with perhaps migrate getting deployed, but it's for all intents and purposes it's just a blank empty chain. Forking, on the other hand, which is a feature of Ganache that we're going to look at in a moment, changes that, in that it allows us to essentially take a snapshot of any chain that you have permissions to access and interact with it, as if you are, have full control of every account and unlimited amounts of ether and so on. Cool. Anything to add, Amal, on these before we jump into kind of a little exploration of forking?
Oh, not at all. No, I think you covered everything nicely.
Sure. Okay, great. Cool. Okay. So yeah, onto forking. Quick side note, we're kind of showing this now because it is a bit more of an intermediate thing. Again, kind of like earlier when we mentioned Open Zeppelin, kind of as much as anything to put on your radar to start with. Also, and that's because it's a feature of Truffle Teams as well, or more specifically sandboxes. So if you're wondering why is he jumping, or they jumping into this slightly more advanced sounding thing or intermediate sounding thing, it's because, well, for a few reasons. One, because we're about to look at it in more context or in more depth anyway, so we just want to kind of frame it. And I guess it's also very important, as this space is maturing, the ability to fork and work with existing on-chain contracts, has arguably grown in importance, and it's quite likely if you're building something in this space, if it's a DeFi type service or solution, that it's not going to be built in a silo, and you're going to want to use this feature. So anyway, getting ahead of myself, but what is it then? Just to spell it out explicitly, it's the ability to take a snapshot or a fork, hence the name of it, of another chain. Very often that's mainnet, because ultimately when you deploy your projects, they're eventually going to land in mainnet, and that's really where the kind of real data and real stuff in quotes is. And again, if that sounds abstract, don't worry. We'll kind of be seeing this as we progress through more episodes. But what it allows you to do, is take a snapshot of it and interact with it locally, as if it's kind of running on your kind of local machine, when in reality, obviously, it's kind of not. It also allows you to take over any account. And also allows you to kind of work with any amounts of ether, even if you don't really have those accounts, don't have ether on mainnet. I often think of it, I don't know how good this analogy actually is, but some I'll put out there anyway, that, think of GitHub and you take a fork of a repository that you don't have write permissions back to. You can then do what you want with that repository, but you can never, write those changes back to the repository that you forked from. So putting that out there for what it's worth. I don't know how useful that is, maybe, but there's some parallel perhaps.
Kevin, I just want to add to that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I like to think about it solves this really important problem. Blockchain is about connecting people, their ideas, which are in contracts, so you can have more. You can just do more, have a fair exchange, etc. So with forking, I like to think of it as you have this matrix mode. You're able to copy this, copy what's out there locally, and enable God mode. You can have access to any account, see what's happening, snoop around to get better insight of what's happening. And it's important because while you're in this God mode locally, you're not spending money, you're not spending ether, and you're not falling into any potential trap that could be out there with a contract that you're not familiar with. And forking allows you to study this in a very lifelike environment.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for that. Reiterating, kind of building on that a little as well. Particularly useful when building, DeFi services, as mentioned, just because the term that's often used is kind of composability, or composable service, where you interacting with an existing thing, be that like Uniswap, which is an exchange. You can do that programmatically by design. It's kind of feature of the platform. So yeah, really, really useful for that. And the alternatives, just as a kind of counterpoint to it, is that you would take, let's say you did want to sort of do something that programmatically interacts with Uniswap or an exchange. You could, of course, take the Uniswap contracts, deploy those locally to a vanilla Ganache instance, and do it that way. But of course, you're not going to, you then also get kind of going down this rabbit hole of having to load like test data into them and all the things, whereas, if you're interacting with a simulated version of the real thing, then all that kind of real state, price data, etc., is there, and interact, you can interact with it in the kind of godlike manner that Amal alluded to. And then finally, the kind of how do you do that? How do you kind of create a fork of an instance? And there's really two ways, potentially a few more, but the kind of two main ones to call out to start with is via Ganache CLI there. And there's kind of nuance on that, but this is one way at least. As mentioned, Ganache does have a kind of standalone binary. You can get ganache.cli, and then you can pass in the fork flag, and then the name of the kind of node or gateway that you want to fork from. So kind of, for example, Cloudflare's gateways listed down there. Caveat is that the network or the node that you're forking from needs to be running in archival mode, which is a more kind of data, intensive mode, because you're essentially kind of interacting with kind of more state and stuff like that. So anyway, just kind of side note, but in the Cloudflare's case, it is. But that's one way. And then the other way, which is kind of segueing us in a moment to Truffle Teams, is via Truffle Teams, and specifically Ganache sandboxes, which is going to be the kind of third flavor of Ganache that we're going to look at today. And then a final point to call out here, we're not really going to see an exact example of forking in action in this episode, just kind of lack of time, I guess. But the plan is in the next episode to, as we start to build on simple storage and evolve it, to actually start doing that and seeing that in action using Truffle Teams and a forked Ganache sandbox. So just kind of set your expectation there as we kind of dip into having a look at the third flavor, e.g. Truffle Teams or Ganache sandboxes. Cool. All right. So diving into that. So as mentioned, this is the third flavor we're going to look at. Randomly jazzy slide here. So what is this flavor? What is Ganache sandboxes? In a nutshell, it's a Ganache instance in the cloud, as it were, kind of a hosted instance. One click, or minimal clicks to kind of get it spun up. And I guess then the why, really it's about, we see this kind of fitting in between, obviously, doing things locally, has some merit and in terms of the workflow and so on. Similarly, when you're perhaps wanting to test stuff in a kind of semi-real manner, you push up to a test net and get the community to interact with it a little bit. But that brings with it a bunch of baggage and kind of caveats. And there is a kind of, we feel, a space in between that, which is, where you want to perhaps test it with colleagues or, friends or peers, before it goes to that kind of test net phase. And of course, before it goes kind of live production style to, mainnet. So yeah, it's kind of where we see it fit is in that kind of space when you want to sort of get it out into the world, but in a kind of slightly more limited capacity. And then the how, kind of already alluded to this, and how we're going to look at is through through Truffle Teams. And as I mentioned already, it's a little bit duplicative here. You can, Truffle Teams or specifically the sandboxing feature, the sandbox feature does support forking, which is really, really cool. Okay, so we're going to go hands-on again with this and have a look at it. So specifically what we're going to look at is ingesting our simple storage project into Truffle Teams. I'm good, by the way, just to set expectations, we're going to gloss over a kind of few things in the context of Teams here. Again, kind of just in the interest of time, but really just because we want to keep it Ganache themed, and we'll be lighting back up or covering Teams in a more broader workflow sense in the next episode as well. So what we'll do is we'll get the repository added, we'll spin up a sandbox, we'll deploy to that sandbox similar to how we've done it earlier, but in a visual manner now. And then we'll fire off a transaction and so on. So let's do that. I guess I'll make this one full screen again. Hopefully you can see that all right. Cool. So now we're in Truffle Teams. Again, glossed over something. I haven't really signed up yet. The way in which you do that is go to my.truffleteams.com, sign up and sign in. It's kind of one step with GitHub. So it uses GitHub for the kind of OAuth provider. You'll then be taken to this screen, or there's a kind of interstitial screen which tells you what this step involves. It's really just about choosing the repository on GitHub that you want to load and kind of work with within Truffle Teams. As you can see here on this instance, I've got a ton. So I will select this webinar series. It will then, because Teams is a build service as well, or specifically a CI, so it does the build, but it also runs the tests. You'll see this tab first, this builds tab. We're going to completely skip over this for now. That's going to be something we cover in the next episode, and give it a bit more kind of thorough exploration. What we are going to do, as mentioned, is just really look at this. Spend time here in the sandbox feature, and this is how create your own Ganache in the cloud instance. You do that with a single click, or it's a couple of clicks. But yeah, click new sandbox. Each time I like to sometimes play around and wait for a really funny name, which is, sorry, just me, because it generates a new name. Of course, you can call it whatever you want. So, and then as we mentioned, you can enable forking, and then you can choose the network or the existing sandbox that you want to fork from. We'll come to that next episode, and actually fork from mainnet and do some kind of cool interactivity with mainnet via the sandbox. So I won't do that just now. Oops. You can also specify a custom network ID and a few other things, but for simplicity's sake, you just tick confirm. And as you can see, it usually takes a couple of seconds. Side note, I'm actually running this on my dev environment, so that's why you're seeing some of these other, the URLs a little bit different to what you're seeing. And that's just because we wanted to give you a little preview of one of the newer features as well, kind of as we get towards the end of this session or this episode, to show you that the debugger, which is a new thing. But basically, other than kind of a few of these URLs, it's going to look identical. But yeah, one click, then you've got your sandbox. This is the RPC URL. So if you wanted to, which we're going to do in a moment, connect to this instance via your Truffle project, via Truffle console, which we'll see in a moment. You need that RPC URL. You need the network ID, so it gives you everything you need there. Change the name if you want. Oh, and also get the mnemonic as well that's generated. Yeah, so you can see really how easy it is. Now that's one thing. How do you kind of start to kind of interact with that or deploy to it in the same way that we did via migrate earlier. So this is analogous to that, and you can just do, this is what we call the visual deployer. So you can just click new deployment, select the commit, because again, this is intrinsically tied to Git or GitHub specifically, but select the commit that you want to deploy. So it doesn't have to always be the latest. You can select a commit from anywhere in the commit history, but we will select the latest one. Select the destination network. So I'm just going to show you, I'm going to click on these, but I'm going to just jump into an existing deployment in a moment. But let's say it was that, what was it called? I think dashing position was the new one that we spun up, right? So select the account, any of the 10 accounts that are created, or with MetaMask, again, kind of get into that, and the deployment context, and then the name of the deployment. So like deployment one, or whatever is a logical naming, if you had a naming convention for it, and then just click start deploying. Now, I'm going to use one that we did earlier just for kind of simplicity's sake, but if I did click OK now, you'll just see a bunch of steps that it goes through to actually, go ahead and deploy it. And very quickly, let's jump into one that we did earlier, and do the same. So this is now what you'd essentially see once you've done the deployment. And you see the contract address for the contract, when the contract's deployed, and you see a list of transactions. This will be blank to start with. So we're going to now do the same thing that we did with Ganache UI to create the transaction there. Back out of this, and then do Truffle console again, and then this time the network being Teams. And we're getting I'll kind of speed through this a little bit. So yeah, we're connected to this Ganache. So essentially it behaves exactly the same, as mentioned. This would be just, an entry in your Truffle config. Again, this is in our docs and stuff, and reach out with any questions, if you're kind of wrestling with that in any way. But now we can do exactly the same as what we did before. Oops, x equals 8, simple storage, deployed, index set, store data, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, same thing. We got the transaction hash, but this time, rather than it being either in our Ganache kind of CLI instance or our Ganache UI instance, it's in our Teams instance. So if all going well, I click refresh. I may have got, I don't know if I kind of went through that a bit quick. I wasn't kind of concentrating if I did the right deployment, because I had a few there already. I'm not seeing that show up yet. So I'll just click into what you'll see is one of them show up here. I think I missed something, possibly, or selected something wrong. I've got a bunch going on here.
Just a quick time check, Kevin. We're at 3 minutes before.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. We're kind of there. We're pretty much there, which is great. Okay. So yeah, thanks for the reminder. But anyway, yeah, just to kind of, as we're kind of nearing the end, you would see that transaction show up there. And this is going to be the challenge, by the way, to kind of go through this flow. Jumping in very quickly to like the kind of new feature that we just wanted to kind of preview or tease you with, which is now live, is our debugger, or visual debugger, as it were. We didn't touch on debugging from the CLI yet. So you can actually debug from within Truffle CLI via Truffle debug, and then the name of the transaction hash. One of the nice things about the visual debugger is, as the name suggests, it gives you a kind of nice visual hook into everything there. And that, or visual representation of it. Now, this isn't going to be exactly the same transaction. I did like 654321, but this is one I kind of just did a little bit before before this session. But yeah, you can step into it. You can see, this is essentially the contract we wrote, started to write last time. This doesn't have the event in it, so this is, but either way, same, kind of essentially the same thing. I just would need to kind of backtrack and kind of redeploy, make sure it's on this version. But then you can just step through and, see, in this case, it was 111. But yeah, so that's kind of something we want to give you a little sort of tease of here. And then just very finally on that, just to show you a kind of slightly more advanced version of the debugger here. Let's just go in and see, something slightly more advanced, in terms of how you can kind of use this. This is actually another Open Zeppelin, contract called Payment Splitter. We refer to, mentioned Open Zeppelin earlier on, and it's using one of their other libraries called SafeMath, which is a kind of safe way of doing kind of basic mathematical stuff. And yeah, you can kind of add, the breakpoints isn't actually live yet, but that's something you can kind of play around with. The debugger in and of itself, minus the breakpoints, is live. So cool. Alrighty. Yeah. Apologies for that last bit. It's kind of quick, but we're kind of getting close to time. So with that, let's jump back to the slides. Full screen it again.
Maybe to the next steps, or do you want to jump to that?
Yeah, pretty much there. I think the only final thing to call out is the life cycle. Kind of caveat, we jumped around a lot in terms of the life cycle, at least. We spent most of the session in Ganache. But last time we talked a bit about, we covered coding, a bit of running tests, obviously building kind of is a given. Then we did a deployment, but in this case, just to different sandboxes. But as we saw, or we teased within Teams, you can do, visual deployments from within there. And by that, I mean to, test, to different networks. And kind of side note, but we're going to be picking this, flow up, or this workflow a bit more thoroughly next episode as well, kind of frame things more, more thoroughly. Cool. All right. So next steps in the challenge. I'll say the first bit, and then Amal, perhaps you want to say the guest book one. So really the first challenge is to kind of do everything that we just showed you, albeit was super quick within Teams. So kind of try that out, just try getting your contract that you created, the simple storage one, and or the challenge if you did that, and get that up on Teams, and then, follow these steps. It invariably, questions will come up, quite likely, ask us on the Truffle Slack community. Shay will give us that link, give out that link again in a moment. I think that's it. And then Amal, did you want to kind of briefly talk through the advanced one?
Just to implement a simple guest book where a person can register and their name will be stored, and then another function that can show who the guests are and maybe a message that they left. This is just to get you into the workflow, trying it out. If you don't succeed and you run into issues, that's still an opportunity to learn. You can ask questions, and we'll be more than happy to get you going.
And if anybody's having a hard time seeing the last thing, because it's blocked by our videos, but the last bullet point says show name. So under the guest book, they're saying register and show name. And as they mentioned, I posted a link in the chat. If you want to go to the next screen, Kevin.
Yeah.
There you go. Again, join us in the Slack community. If you're not already there, there is a webinars channel where you can continue the conversation around these exercises and talk to Kevin and Amal around, troubleshooting or sharing your experience. So we'd love to see you there. Free to join. There's a link in the chat. And then we have one question, Kevin and Amal. So I know we're at the hour, but let's see if we can squeeze that in. One question here is, and we have a lot of comments too. Does Ganache also work with other Ethereum-powered networks like Quorum? Actually, Josh had answered it, but go ahead. You guys go ahead, and Kevin, if you want to chime in.
No, I don't believe with Quorum. And by Ganache, I mean, do you mean like Ganache UI, connecting to a Quorum?
Let me go ahead. I'll share Josh's answer. I think it was a good answer. He said basically it currently supports Ethereum and Corda. That said, other than the privacy features, Ethereum and Quorum have feature parity. So you can test smart contracts without privacy features in Ganache and ensure they'll work on Quorum network as well. So you guys can see that in the question. There's a comment there. You should be able to see that as well, everybody. But I think does that help, Kevin? I think that does.
Yeah. No, thanks. Okay. Josh, we're kind of jumping in with that one.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, Josh is absolutely right. Quorum doesn't have a ton. I mean, it's a fork of Ethereum at the end of the day. It just has the ability to send maybe a few other things, but send private transactions, e.g., between two addresses that will not be, stored anywhere. That's not supported by Ganache in and of itself. But you would, manually spin up a Quorum node and, kind of do, similar things. Yeah.
Yeah, and Josh did mention that Quorum is on our radar for Ganache. So that is something that we're looking at. It's on our roadmap. Can you toggle to the second to last screen, Kevin? Yeah, there. Just want to quickly say before everybody goes, before we wrap up, that again, we would love for you guys to join us at TruffleCon. If you haven't registered already, please click on the button below. It's free to register right now. And if you want to add a chocolate tasting experience, it's still available. Super cool, something very unique to our conference. It's worth it. So I would highly recommend it. Of course, this is free to register, so you're getting a lot of great stuff with this conference. You get a free month of Truffle Teams, which is fantastic. You also are going to be able to access a lot of great topics this year that we're talking about: DeFi, security. We have a beginner's track, of course, enterprise, and of course our newest theme is blockchain for social good. And we actually have a poker charity tournament that's connected with that. And we have the Built with Truffle showcase, which is new this year. So if you have a project you'd like to share with us or showcase or present, you can book a slot or time either on Friday or Saturday. November 6th and 7th is the conference. And you can present. Josh and I will be running the room, but everybody from the Truffle community, anybody who's attending, is welcome to join and sit in or walk in as well. But we would love for you guys to sign up for that, and we'll ping you on the Slack community, and I'll add a link here too. And then if you want to skip to the last slide, Kevin.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So yeah, and I'll let you kind of wrap this up for us.
Cool. Yeah, no, thanks, Shay. Just kind of clarification just with Truffle Teams as well, because you mentioned like a free month. There is a very, Truffle Teams is free. Well, it has a free tier, so you can get a free sandbox with that, and that can be forked and so on. Just wanted to clarify that. And then there's what Shay was alluding to is the pro, Truffle Team. I think that's how we refer to it. where you just
Yes, Truffle Teams Pro. That's right. Full feature. You'll be able to test it out, and you'll be able to basically you'll get a coupon code with your registration, and you can redeem that at any point. But we encourage you to use that during the conference. Maybe redeem it for the month of November because you might have used it already. But either way, if you already have Teams, it'll extend you a free month regardless. Or if you've never used it, free month. So either way, you'll have access to Teams during the conference.
Cool. Yeah. Hey, thanks, Shay. So that's it. And I think that, the key takeaways are, and again, we kind of went pretty quick towards the end with that challenge. We'll send out the details of that as per last episode as well. But yeah, any questions that come up, both with the challenge, when we get that out, or anything else, anything that we covered today, because again, some of it was a little quick, so apologies if we kind of glossed over a few things and stuff. But yeah, reach out. We're happy to take as much time as is needed to kind of get you unstuck on anything and answer the questions that you might have. And then next episode we will kind of just be continuing in. We'll be looking a bit more at forking, reframing the workflow, because again we jumped around a bit, but we'll kind of step back and kind of look at that in a more methodical manner as well. With that from myself, at least, thanks so much for listening. And any final closing comments, Amal?
Oh, no, thanks. I'm good.
Thanks. Yeah. Cool.
Well, I want to say thank you, Kevin and Amal. That was fantastic. Again, another wonderful episode around this topic. And we hope to see you guys for our next episode. We will announce that shortly. Again, you will receive a link to this recording since you are registered. And we hope to see you on Slack too. So thank you again for tuning in, everyone.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, guys.